Welcome explorers. Today, dive into the thrilling TTP narration of Hunting with Predators by Banancake, a 25-part fan-made saga from the Nature of Predators series by Spacepaladin15 on r/HFY.
Memory transcription subject, Vikri, Venlil volunteer crewman of UNS Cardinal. Date, standardized human time, October 30, 2136, 13 days after the Battle of Earth. I walked out the door into the swirling, frigid air. The sun was setting on the horizon, warming the dark sky with a soft, orange glow. A golden halo surrounded it as it settled into the mist over the mountains. It was quiet. Only the whistling wind moved through the empty streets. I crossed my arms and shivered as I left the hospital parking lot. It was getting cold fast. I'd need to be quick. I remembered the man mentioning a barn, so I searched for one of those to start. I certainly wasn't going to find one in the middle of town, so I made my way toward the outskirts, mantling fences as the terrain opened up. A predator saved my life. That's happened twice now with two completely different species. One of which wasn't even sapient. It was comical how wrong we were. In the distance, I could see a tall, white building. Through the windows and the spaces in the wood, I could see the familiar glow of a fire. I picked up the pace. Suddenly, a thought crossed my mind. I'm alone on a planet teeming with predators, in the middle of a field, and I'm not afraid. My senses were heightened but without the haze that normally came with it. I was aware of everything around me, the endless expanse of nature that I was now a part of. I felt alive. I felt free. I chuckled to myself as I fumbled down the hill toward the barn. I craned my neck up at the tall door as I approached. There were no locks, just a simple latch binding the two doors shut. With some effort, I dislodged the plank, and it dangled from one hinge, creaking as it swayed back and forth gently. I nervously began pushing the door open. The bottom dragged against the ground. I had to drive into it with my shoulder to create enough space to fit inside. As I slipped through, the bag on my shoulders snagged on the wood. I was now wedged between the two heavy barn doors. I had no more leverage to keep the door open wide enough. I strained to try to pull myself through. It was no use. I caught my breath and tried again. The door suddenly opened wider, and I fell to the dirt. My bag was ripped open, the contents spilled out onto the ground. 3 cans of assorted meats went rolling across the floor. At least, I assumed that was what they were by the images on the labels. Strangely, the humans didn't call most meat the same thing they called the animal it came from like my group had. As I lay there back first in the dirt, a figure loomed over me. It was the same old man from earlier today. He was wearing a heavy denim coat and had an open book in his hand. He snapped the book shut as he looked down at me with blue eyes that reflected the orange light of the nearby fire burning in a wood stove. At first, he wore a confused expression, but that changed to a smile as he seemed to recognize me. "Oh, it's you. Nice of you to stop by." I began to sit up before I heard panting as Lucky walked over, staring down at me. As I feared, she started licking me once again. I grunted and shut my eyes as I sat up, shielding myself with my arms. Lucky sat down in front of me as I stood up. "Why does she do that?" I asked as I wiped my face. The old man laughed gruffly. "It's a sign of affection. She likes you." He knelt down and picked up a can. "Canned sausage, huh? Thought you furballs didn't eat meat." "Oh, no, it's not for me, it's for her." I pointed down at Lucky, who was still watching us curiously. "Oh. Well then." He tossed the can around in his hand. "Anything to keep her from running around town, I guess." He pulled a tab on top of the can, peeled off the lid, and handed it to me. I recoiled slightly at the sight of cylindrical slices of flesh packed together in grimy water. Lucky picked up the scent immediately and approached me. She sniffed excitedly at the can in my hands. She stood on her hind legs briefly before I set the can down in front of her. The can had started sloppily devouring the meat. Her tail wagged back and forth rapidly. I stood up and looked up at the man. I'm Vickery, by the way. Q. The man lifted the cap on his head slightly before putting it back on, revealing his thin gray hair. So you know this dog? Yeah, we call her Lucky. And isn't she a wolf? I asked, looking back at Lucky. She was already chewing on the last sausage. Hugh placed his hands on his hips as he seemed to study her. I'd say about half. Maybe a little more. I was confused. I stared at Lucky briefly as she gulped down the last bite. She looked at me with amber eyes that glowed in the light of the fire as she licked her chops. She's half wolf. How can you tell? I'll show you. Hugh picked up another can. Let's see if she likes tuna. He opened the can and set it in front of him. Lucky hurried over and started eating without hesitation. I'll take that as a yes, Hugh laughed. He gently ran his hand over her back. Take a close look at her coat. Wolves have a gradient to their fur, but Lucky's is more defined. The patterns are more or less symmetrical. He had a clump of loose fur in his hand from Lucky's back. And if you look at the strands themselves, he scooted closer to me. All solid colors. Wolves have banded fur, where each hair can be multiple colors. I took the clump of fur from his palm. It was so fine and soft, and sure enough, all solid colors. I sat on a nearby bucket as Lucky licked the can clean. This whole time, we thought she was a wolf. How do you know all this? Hugh sat down on a stool next to the stove, rubbing his hands together. Well, now that's a story a night couldn't contain, but I'll give you the short of it. When I was young, which was so long ago now, he chuckled briefly, I lived way up north in Canada, and I had 6 dogs just like her. He gestured to Lucky, who had laid down after finishing the tuna. I knew there was no way she could understand us, but she almost seemed to be listening intently. Hugh seemed to get more excited the more he spoke. He started talking with his hands as he continued. They were my sled dogs, and they were beautiful beasts, strong as an ox and as fast as a hare. I could go on all night about the adventures we had. One time He was getting ahead of me really fast. I raised a paw to interject, and he looked over at me. Yes? What are sled dogs? I asked somewhat timidly. Oh. That's right, you're not even from here. Well, the way it works, in a nutshell, is you hook them up in 2 rows side by side to a sled that goes over the snow. You hop on the sled, and they pull you where you need to go. Nowadays, it's mostly only done as a sport, but way back before even my time, it was the fastest way to get around in snowy places like this. I was confused. How would you get them to pull you? It seems like it'd take a lot of coordination. Hugh laughed gruffly. Well, obviously, it's a bit more complicated than that, but that creature there is much smarter than you give her credit for, he said, pointing to Lucky. Give her the right motivation, and you could train her to do anything. I looked down at Lucky, who rested her head on the hay scattered on the floor. Well, I don't think I could train her to do anything, but that's interesting. Hugh seemed to study me for a moment, sporadically glancing between Lucky and me. You know, I thought you folks were afraid of predators. Why seek her out? Lucky lifted her head and looked at me as if expecting an answer. I sighed. She saved my life. From a grizzly, no less. She had no reason to. In fact, I had no interest in even interacting with her until that point. I took in a breath. We're leaving tomorrow to do something dangerous, and I just didn't want her to go hungry. I thought it was the least I could do. The thought of leaving Lucky behind filled me with guilt. Something about her reminded me of how I felt when meeting the humans for the first time. My eyes stung as I looked down at her. After a moment, Hugh shifted where he's Saturday. If you want a logical explanation, then I'd say that your scent reminds her of someone. Maybe her master. But if she's here, then she was either abandoned or, well, her master's dead. He leaned forward. But I believe dogs have a hidden power. They know when people are hurting. They know who needs them. I think she chose to save you for that simple fact. You needed her. He smiled. And I think you still do. She's gonna follow you around whether you want her to or not. I laughed somewhat anxiously. We know nothing about each other. We're from entirely different worlds. I don't want to be her master. I have no clue how I'd even begin to do that. I sighed as I looked down at her. I'll make sure she's safe and in good hands, though. I mean, you seem to know what you're. Not my dog. Hugh chuckled as he cut me off. You have any idea how much she perks up when she sees you? I'm telling you, she sees something in you that you never could. I stood up. Lucky sat up from the ground and looked up at me as I paced, following me back and forth. It just won't work. I can't care for her like a human could. Even if I could, there's no way she'd be allowed on Venlil Prime. I stopped pacing, gazing at the far wall. The thought of returning to Venlil Prime was never a focus in my imagination. It seemed so far away now. What would I do? Just go back to my job and be an engineer? I was so different now, life couldn't just resume as normal. What would I do when this was all said and done? Could I bring myself to let the humans go back to fighting without me? I might never see them again, regardless. Panic started swelling in my chest once again, and my breathing started to quicken. I pinned my ears to my head with my paws, trying to stop the feedback loop from starting in my head. Suddenly every deafening thought was interrupted by a loud, snappy bark from Lucky that made my ears ring for a brief moment. I jumped as my back hit the barn door with a thud. Panting, I looked down to see Lucky with a can of meat in front of her. She licked her chops as she looked up at me, whining quietly. Hugh laughed boisterously. Wolves also don't bark like that. Lucky nearly scared me right back out the door, but it quickly pulled me out of that spiral. I placed a paw over my chest and slowed my breathing back down. I hunched over before cautiously approaching her. I picked up the can and snapped off the lid. The sight of the moistened amalgamation of flesh inside made me gag slightly as I hurriedly put it back down in front of Lucky. As I leaned forward, the can had wasted no time. Lucky began licking me in the face once again. At first, I was frightened, but I remembered that this was supposed to signify affection. Like so many human expressions, it seemed hostile at first glance, but it held no ill intent. Regardless, it was still gross. This dog had just eaten 2 containers of meat and was probably getting leftovers in my fur. Possibly even in my mouth. I spat as I pushed away from her. All right. All right. I shouted as I stood up, wiping my face. Lucky started devouring the final can of food. Despite how disgusted I was, I couldn't help but find it endearing. I snickered to myself while I watched her eat. Hugh chuckled before he grunted. I suppose you make a good point, but she's gonna get real sad if you leave. She's already lost her master, and it can't have been easy out there alone. Took a lot of time for her to even let me near her. She still gets a bit skittish around me. He stood up and waddled over, grunting slightly as he knelt next to me. But if your people could give humans a chance, then I don't see why they couldn't do the same for her. Of course, it would take a lot of work, but I think it could be done. He tilted his head slightly. But then again, if you want to stick around and help us out when this is all said and done, then I don't see why you couldn't just live here. My ears twitched before I looked over at him. He was serious. At first, it seemed absurd, but the more I thought about it, the less ridiculous it became. The humans would need to rebuild their fleet eventually, and if I wanted to help them do that, then I'd be in the system for a long time either way. There would be no shortage of work for me to do. But above all, I actually kind of liked it here. This planet was equal parts dangerous and beautiful, and by this point, I had become rather accustomed to the danger. It would take a lot of work and a lot of learning, but maybe I could build a life here. I stood up. Maybe. I walked to the door and turned around before leaving. When I get back, I want you to teach me everything you know. Hugh smiled. I look forward to it. Lucky barked one last time as I shut the door behind me. 3 a.m. arrived quickly. I walked to the airport with the rest of the group, still weary from my short-lived rest. Sleeping was nearly impossible. There was so much on my mind. At least now, it had a more hopeful outlook. I observed the humans as we walked. There was focus and determination in their eyes, but mixed within it was a swirling trepidation. They were ready to go on the hunt. Grant still held the same bulky rifle on one of his shoulders. Despite everything we went through, he'd managed to keep it in pristine condition. They all had the same jackets they'd been wearing since we landed, covered in tears, mud, snow, and blood. Curiously, they kept their spears with them as well. They were noticeably shorter than they were when they made them, and they were still stained with the blood of the creatures that dared to stand between them and survival, predator or prey. I doubted they'd be much use against armed crocodile, but they made traversing rough terrain much easier on the humans. Next to Tenga was Sigra, who had wrapped herself in a dark blue blanket, obscuring her face from the sides. She trembled as she walked, but it seemed she really did intend to go through with the plan of talking them down. How well that would go, however, was still anyone's guess. Lives depended on her ability to suppress her fear, not just those of the crocodile and anyone else who might be accompanying them, but perhaps those of the humans as well. I was unsure, but I trusted Tenga, and he seemed to believe that she could do it. Besides, if I knew anything about human strategy, we still had plans B and C. We arrived at the airport parking lot, where a couple of vehicles waited. They were civilian trucks, one of which was laden with equipment. As we approached, a human soldier finished placing a set of chains around the bulky tires on the vehicles. Commander Foster walked out from behind one of the trucks, huddled under a black jacket. "Morning, Lieutenant. We're ready to go." In the bed of one of the trucks, a human soldier, covered in a thick layer of dark winter gear, looked over at us. He smiled slightly and waved. I waved back somewhat timidly, as did Querek behind me. He was the only one of the 5 sitting in the back that didn't have their eyes locked squarely on Sigra. The Gojid shielded her face from them, but her body language suggested that she knew they were staring at her. Foster exhaled an icy breath. "Ammo is pretty tight, so if things go south, make your shots count. You especially." She handed a magazine to Grant. 10 shots. "Better than 4, Grant said as he clipped the black box into the bottom of his rifle. Foster nodded. "We'll get into specifics as we get closer and find out where they are exactly." She handed me the tablet. The large battery prevented the casing from being closed up completely, but in a very human fashion, they seemed to have solved that issue with duct tape. "Keep this powered off until we're closer. There's no telling when it might give out on us again." I nodded as I held the device close. Tenga took a deep breath. "All right. Sigra, you're in the cab with me. It's gonna be a long drive."